It's not that freedom isn't a good thing. It's that excessive freedom without any structure at all can also make us feel untethered.
I want the women watching this to appreciate all the options that they have.
Freedom has become a pressure. There's become a societal pressure to be free.
Do you think that there is a cost to hookup culture and casual sex?
Like, why? Do you not see the contradiction there?
That does not mean women do not have sexual urges that are exciting. Yeah, I know. Do not have right.
No.
大家好，我是吴志六。上一集的5至6开讲，我们聊了现代的父权主义是如何摧毁现代的男性。如果你还没看过的话，可以点右上角这边。那这次我们就来谈谈女性主义好了。当然，我一个大男人讲女生的事好像显得有点自我意识过剩了，所以我们今天就把舞台留给3位女性主义者之间的一个辩论。那虽然都是女性主义者呢，但他们在不同的议题上也各自拥有不同的看法。
Louise, what is your professional background and what do I need to understand and know about your experiences that feed into your perspective on this subject?
So my professional background, I'm a journalist. I write about ideas for a living. I don't have like a political agenda. I just write and say things that I think are true.
Louise, can you define for me what you mean by sexual revolution for anybody that doesn't know? Because it's going to be quite an important term today.
Right. So I think that there are two things really. The ideological event really of the 1960s and 1970s. So this was a period of, not just in relation to sexual relationships, but all sorts of things, a period of really questioning and challenging traditional ideas, and particularly traditional Christian ideas about what sexual relationships ought to look like. I think actually the point that we've reached in terms of progressive culture is the assumption that those traditional ideas are necessarily questionable, are necessarily fit to be challenged. I think that's the ideological thing that we're talking about. But there's this other thing that happens at the same time, which is partially connected, which is a material change. So you have the introduction of the pill, the advent of safe abortion. Remember, historically, abortion is not safe. So you have the advent of safe abortion and, of course, its decriminalization. You have things like the washing machine and central heating and all sorts of other domestic appliances, domestic technologies, which actually have been enormously important in changing sexual relationships, because all of a sudden it means that it basically takes less time to run a home, and so it becomes more possible for women to enter the workforce. So then you see this wave of not only changing marriage rates and birth rates, but also women entering the labour force en masse, and really some enormous social changes, like so enormous that it can be a little bit hard in 2025 to realise how enormous they were, because we've become used to them.
We'll talk about all of that today. Going clockwise then, Erica, same question to you about your background and the work that's fed into the perspective you have.
I'm a psychoanalyst in private practice. I'm an author. I write books about parenting, and the book I'm probably most well known for is my book Being There, and it's basically about the neuroscience of attachment, or the importance of mothers in the first 3 years of a child's life to create emotional security, which lays down the foundation for mental health in the future. And so from my perspective, I guess the conversation we're going to have, I should say right off the bat, I consider myself a feminist. But I consider myself a term that I like better and that my community uses, the people that I work with, and which is I consider myself a maternal feminist. Basically, there was a school of thought called maternal feminism, which really elevated women in their work as mothers and really talked about it as very important work. And so I'm not an anti-feminist, and I'm certainly for women to have choice. So it'll be an interesting discussion. I guess you could say I'm more of a centrist on this topic. As Louise said, there are parts of feminism that I think really helped women, and there are parts that really did a lot of harm to children.
And lastly, Deborah.
Yes.
Same question to you.
So I am best known as the host of the Guilty Feminist podcast. And I started that podcast to learn about feminism. And I have since researched a lot. I wrote a book called The Guilty Feminist. I've just written a book called 6 Conversations We're Scared to Have, which does also challenge some of the directions that we've gone, but more in about how combative we've become as progressive people to each other, and how difficult it is to talk to people on the right now, and how we need to get back in rooms and we need to be having difficult discussions like this. So it's interesting what Louise says about being raised in a progressive household, but then being disillusioned. and thinking that there's some ways in which life was better before the sexual revolution, because I'm effectively a time traveler. I did live before the sexual revolution because when I was 14, just coming into my puberty, my family joined a religious cult. I didn't have any normal sexual development, and I didn't escape that patriarchal cult till I was in my mid-20s. So I know what it is, and I do not believe women want it. I know what it is to not have autonomy, to not have agency, and to not have emotional freedom. And those are the three big things that I think the sexual revolution gave women. First of all, agency. I think agency is so important. So agency is just the ability to go around and choose what you do moment to moment. And autonomy is, can I decide what my life looks like, the shape of my life? What choices do I have? And emotional freedom is the third one. And I don't think the sexual revolution did give us emotional freedom, because I think we're still sitting in a lot of guilt as women as to, like, if I'm at work, I should be at home with my children. If I'm at home with my children, am I providing for them financially well enough? Or am I going to have a career when I go back to work? If I'm doing both of those things very well, am I a good enough daughter, friend? Am I running a half marathon for charity? Like, we are in a stage of such guilt. That's why my show and one of my books is called The Guilty Feminist, because I felt that feminism had become another thing to feel guilty about. And so anything to me that engenders more shame in women or more guilt in women, or takes their autonomy away, even emotionally, for me, I would like to move far away from that. Mm-hmm. Because in my life, every year I've been away from that cult, and I have had more autonomy and more emotional freedom. I have felt more spaciousness, and I have become a better person, mm-hmm. a better partner. I have maternal roles in my life. It makes me so much better in those roles if I'm filled up, if I'm creatively fulfilled. And it also makes me a better person in my community in every way. So that's, for me, what feminism is.
好，那么在这场辩论中，他们三人其实都自称为女性主义者，但理念和观点上也有诸多不同的点。历史上目前已经经历过了4次女性的主义潮。第一波的女性主义运动大约在19世纪初，而主要的诉求呢是女人应享有投票权。第二波的女性主义运动始于大概60到90年代，主要的诉求是包括职场上的男女平权，以及女性的生育权、堕胎权和对于性自主的解放。至于第三波始于90年代后，也是我认为让女性主义这个运动开始变调的一个开始。从这一波开始呢，加入了 queer， 也就是非男女两个性别的第三性概念。而性别认同的这个问题也让许多旧世代的女权主义者和新世代的女权主义者互相产生矛盾。而从2012年到现在，又被称为了第4波女性主义潮，包括大家所熟知的 Me Too 运动。那相较于前面2波的女权运动呢，第3波以及第4波并没有一个很统一的调调，应该说没有一个核心的诉求或是具体的方案，是要透过什么法律还是什么工具来完成他们的诉求，以至于女性主义这个词已经被各种派系的言论给冲散掉了。里面的议题已经扩张的过于庞大。那如果我今天赞成女性的性自主以及安全，因此说认为我自己是个女性主义者，但同时呢，我却拒绝生理为男性的跨性别女性，那请问我还算是一位女性主义者吗？那因为各种不同派系和不同意的标准，导致人们对于现代女性主义的认知甚至是一知半解，还会把觉醒文化还有女性主义各种东西给混淆在一起，甚至有人认为 argue 说到现在还仍然持续着第2波的女性主义潮。因为他们的诉求，例如同工却不同酬等 gender pay gap issue 仍未达到解决。
If I reflect on those 3 words, Louise, autonomy, emotional freedom, and agency as the byproduct of the sexual revolution, would you agree with that?
Yes and no. So I think that, can I give an example that is like quite dark, but I think throws us immediately into like some of these really difficult questions about freedom and whose freedom, right? There's this line from Matthew Arnold that I really like. Freedom is a really good horse to ride, but to ride somewhere. Like, freedom ought to have a purpose, right? And so an example from my professional life, which I think highlights some of the issues about sexual revolution promoting freedom, the law around BDSM. I won't go into the details because it's boring, but there's like complicated law around BDSM, basically. Like, so this is bondage, domination, sadomasochism. So people basically doing consensually violent or abusive things in sex. So stuff that would be illegal if there weren't consent, pretty much. And the law around it is complicated. The law basically says that you can consent up to a certain level of harm. And then above that level of harm, you're criminally liable. And if something goes wrong, like, you're done for it. And there's been ongoing campaigns by proponents of sexual freedom to loosen these laws and to make it so that you can consent to more than what you legally can at the moment. So consent to, like, serious body modifications as a sex thing, or consent to quite serious violence as a sex thing. Like, if something goes wrong at the moment, you might be criminally liable. So me and a bunch of other feminists set up a group called We Can't Consent to This. The reason we did this is because there were an increasing number of cases in the UK, this isn't unique to the UK, of women who had died during sex and their partners claimed that they had consented to the violence that killed them. So this was normally strangulation, but there were other, like, horrible ways in which these women died. And these men were getting away with this in the sense that they were successfully claiming, no, this was all just a sex game. And they were successfully avoiding a murder prosecution and sometimes getting very light sentences for manslaughter. And I think this is a really, really good example of freedom for who and freedom for what. Because you can completely see why some campaigners would want the law on BDSM to be much more liberal. And they would say, and they do say, you know, I'm a consenting adult. Who are you to tell me that I can't do X, Y, Z in the bedroom? Who are you to tell me that the law ought to step in and try and criminalise what adults do in the privacy of their own homes? And you can see their argument. But then I say, okay, but the problem is we're all connected to one another and your freedoms impact on mine. And this all, you know, a society is greater than the sum of its parts. And if you're going to say that sexual freedom is the preeminent value, then I don't know what we do in these cases, these concrete cases where it seems to me that a terrible wrong has been done to this woman. And if we don't have illiberal laws, at least partially illiberal laws, then men who make this defense are going to get away with it. And so I'm sorry this is a dark example to, like, kick off the conversation with, but I just think it's a pertinent example of how freedom is difficult and agency is difficult and choice is difficult. And we can say that these things are good generally. I think they are good generally, but they are virtues that need to be balanced against other virtues. And that's the challenge.
Freedom is a wonderful thing. No one would want to take freedom away from human beings, but excessive freedom without structure is not good for human beings. So I'll use the example because I talk about children a lot. If you raise your children with respect for their will, that is a good thing, right? You don't want to quash their will. You want to support their individuality and support their choices. And even when raising children, you're going to give them choices. Do you want eggs or waffles for breakfast? Do you want to wear your green pants or your blue pants? No more than that with small children. But if you don't provide any structure for them, they don't feel loved, they don't feel secure, they don't feel stable. And so what I'm afraid of is that we went too far. It's not that freedom isn't a good thing. It's that excessive freedom without any structure at all can also make us feel untethered, unbound, without connections to the people that we're most intimate with. And that's my concern. So it's not that sexual freedom isn't a good thing. It's that in my mind, it may have gone too far.
那很明显的 Deborah 的立场比较偏向于现代女性主义而另外两位则偏向比较传统的女性主义。我们辩论的第一个话题就是围绕在性爱方面，包括女性的性自主、女性对于性的看法，以及社会对于女性的种种偏见等等。那 Louis and Erica 的观点是认为说，自由固然是美好且令人向往的，但无限制的自由以及过多的自由会导致社会失去了规范。那我们先等 Deborah 发言完再来聊聊双方的看法。
Just to add to that before you jump in there, despite the general decline in sex, especially amongst younger people, societal acceptance of casual sex has grown quite rapidly. In the UK, approval of casual sex rose from just 10% in 1999 to 42% in 2022.
The hookup culture.
Yeah.
So when you say rules and structure, Erica, I'm really interested in that turn of phrase because, of course, children need rules and structure, but women aren't children.
Well, we're all children. Men are children too. From a psychoanalyst perspective, there's a child in everyone.
Of course, but I think when we're talking about rules and grown women, we are really, really in dangerous water because we are looking at a society that is increasingly closing down on women and telling women where they could do better, be better. If we're looking at an extreme example, we're looking at Iran in 1970s and women in parliament and women walking around as part of the sexual revolution in miniskirts and having a wonderful time. And then you're looking at women in Iran now, you're looking at women in Afghanistan now. Women in Afghanistan now have rules and they have structure. They can't stand near a window. They can't leave the house without a man. They can't they can't use their voice in public. They can't sing. Like anything that says rules to me, I'm immediately like, firstly, our society has plenty of structure. We have a lot of structure. We all have to work to make a living. We are all encouraged into monogamous relationships, and there's a feel that you're successful if you find the one and get married and have 2.4 children. There's so much structure in our lives. There's very little time for relaxation or even considering what we really might want to do. I would be very intrigued to know what you mean by women should have rules.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
So first of all, I don't agree with you. If I can just say that I don't agree that we are encouraging monogamy. I think we're encouraging polygamy. And I don't mean marriage polygamy. I mean multiple partners. Young people are hooking up. I wrote an article for the Institute for Family Studies on why and the statistics on the hookup culture and what it's doing to young people in terms of their mental health. It's causing them to feel more depressed, more anxious, more embarrassed, having more regrets, self-esteem issues. It's got some major implications, and we're talking the statistics say 72 to 82%, 72% of young men and 82% of women, young women are feeling depressed and anxious after these casual sexual encounters. Tinder has an ad that says, meet the love of your night. What it does is it takes something so sacred and intimate, and it turns it into something not just casual, but it turns it into something irrelevant, unimportant, and dangerous, if you ask me, emotionally dangerous. And it can be physically dangerous. If you're having casual sex, you could get a sexually transmitted disease. AIDS is still around. I think in a way, what we've taught our kids and what I encourage the young people that I work with is that experiment with sex. Care about the people that you're experimenting with. Find people who care about you and who you care about. So that structure.
Can I just counter about this sort of idyllic option of monogamy? In the United Kingdom, the police receive a domestic abuse-related call every 30 seconds. Yet it's estimated that less than 24% of domestic abuse crime is reported to the police. 1 in 4 women in England and Wales will experience domestic abuse in her lifetime. On average, nearly 2 women are killed a week in this country. And I know that America has a similar story, but probably worse because there's guns. This is around the world. It's the same in Australia. It is not an either or. It's not that women were so happy and fulfilled in the 1950s because their husbands would go to work. And I mean, watch Mad Men, which is it's a sort of researched idea of how things often were for women then and men, and how, Don Draper would go off into the city. He would have a fulfilling career. Then he would sleep with any number of women and come home to his wife who knew he was having affairs, who could sense it, who could vibe it, who could smell the perfume, and had to just put up with it until she couldn't any longer. Mm. And she was at risk of STDs. Because he was going out and doing whatever he wanted. The idea that a sort of monogamy is this utopia. And since we've gone into a more hookup culture, I still think there's a hell of a lot of pressure for people to find the right one. Yes, people hook up before they find the right one, but there is pressure to have the rom-com ending. Most people, if they're hooking up, are hooking up to have sexual satisfaction while they are looking for a longer-term relationship. Or they're not, and they're really happy single, and they're finding fulfillment. And that is the spaciousness and the freedom and the autonomy to do that. I love that women can choose that now. I love that women can say, I'm really happy single. This settling for someone who's not good enough for me, or it doesn't suit me, or it doesn't fit me, doesn't have to happen for me anymore. I can live my full self, and maybe my career is more important to me or fulfilling, or my friendships or my desire for travel. I love that we have options. I want the women watching this to appreciate all the options that they have. All the options that they have. If they want to be single, they want to hook up, if they're looking, but in the meantime having that sexual freedom, I want them to have it all. But if what they want is this monogamy that you're talking about, to find the love of their life and settle down and have 2 children or whatever they want, I want them to have that too.
那这边 Erica 和 Deborah 围绕在框架 structure 的议题来辩论。Erica 认为说，约炮的文化，甚至说现在速食恋爱的这种自由风气，是有害于年轻人的心理的。他强调，不应该为了这种自由而将本该只发生在伴侣之间的性爱变得廉价。而他提出的建议是当然我们该鼓励年轻人去探索任何的可能性，也包括性爱，但务必是与你在乎的人以及在乎你的人。而 Deborah 则反击认为说，Erica 嘴上说的这种一夫一妻制的文化是过于理想的乌托邦，认为说人们对于自己能不能找到那个对的人是一个很大的压力。因此他主张随着现在进入了更开放的约会文化，人人都应该享有追求性满足的权利。那老实说呢，我认为 Deborah 最后的发言才是重点。他主张是，如果你身为一位女性，只要有性，不想要有爱，你也是可以到处约炮的。而如果你坚持就找到那一位天命之子的话，你也可以。他主张是这种自由的权利。但从另外一个辩论角度上来说 ，Deborah 的辩证确实比较弱。毕竟 Erica 提供了数据以及研究来去佐证他的说辞，认为说约炮以及速食恋爱的文化使年轻人的心理变得更糟糕。也举例了像说 Tinder 这种交友软体，甚至是鼓励人们去发生一夜情。而 Deborah 则是先举了一个他自己都知道偏极端的阿富汗女性受到塔利班迫害的例子，来去 counter Erica 所说的框架。那后来则是不断强调女性该拥有自由，女性也该享有性爱等，就让我好奇说，现在的社会好像也没有限制说女生不能做这些事吧？那既然这样的话 ，Deborah 要争取的女性选择权，应该是指如果一位女性去约炮，她可能会被社会认为是个 slut， 很不检点，而男性却不会受到这样的标签的情况。那问题是，男性明明也会被称作是渣男或者是毒屌等，甚至我一个男士也根本不觉得这有什么好值得夸耀的。那如果你说因为你认为男生的海王或是几人斩的这种标签是个称赞的话，是不是代表了你其实也认同你那最痛恨的父权主义思想呢？再加上你提倡的两性平等的方式是，既然男生能随便约炮，女生也应该能随便约炮，且不应该被指责这种比烂的想法，而不是从根本上去否定约炮文化。那当然我也有我自己的立场，从之前做过的关于速食恋爱的影片，你大概听得出来。但目前这一轮的发言看下来 ，Deborah 给我的感觉是一直用自由以及选择权等这种好听的话来去包装她的欲望，认为因为自由，所以女性不应该去承担自由所带来的后果。那如果有那些后果，就代表这不是真正的自由。这种互相矛盾其实有点不切实际的论述。
Deborah, can I ask, do you think that there is a cost to hookup culture and casual sex in regards to the implications it has on women, as Erica was implying, psychologically? And is that more adverse in women than men?
I think human beings can suffer from too much choice. Like, we know that if you put 800 varieties of jam out on a supermarket shelf, people will buy less jam than if you put out 8, because they get confused and they just think, oh God, I don't know, none of it then, and they walk away. I think the fact that we have young people sitting in a bar on a hinge date, and while that person goes to the bar, they're like, what else is out there? I think that's bad for human beings. Mm-hmm. I think that is bad for women, for men, for non-binary people. That's bad for everybody.
But this sort of sacredness, Erica was alluding to a sacredness of sex itself.
Yes, I think that is not a thing, that we are somehow finding women find sex more sacred than men.
I didn't say that women find it. I think it's sacred for men and women, but
So you were speaking to sort of sacredness to it. And I know, Louise, in your work, you've talked about how there's different implications for men and women as it relates to casual sex.
So I think that hookup culture basically is better suited to the average preferences of men than of women. So the average preferences of men are more likely to be towards the having lots of partners, jumping into bed really quickly, into the spectrum, basically. And this is what psychologists call sociosexuality. So men are generally more unrestricted in their sociosexuality than are women. And hookup culture favors the highly sociosexual. And actually, you can see this if you look at campus dating cultures and sexual cultures, which are interesting because in a way, university campuses are almost a closed environment. You've got all these young, horny people hanging out, not very much to do, and like interacting with one another. And on campuses which have more men than women, so the women are the scarcer resource, basically, assuming everyone's heterosexual, right? They tend to have more conservative sexual cultures, so more monogamy, less hooking up, people wait longer to have sex, etc. On campuses where there are fewer men and more women, which increasingly is true of all universities, actually,
60
because
to 40,
you have the opposite. You have more hookup culture because basically the men are the scarce resource and they can set the terms, and men prefer more hookup culture. There are obviously exceptions, this is all true, but at the population level, I think that's really good evidence that actually women en masse don't like hookup culture and are actually engaging with it because they sort of have to.
What you're talking about there is very young women who have just left home. It's their first exploration into sex. Now, if you ask a 32-year-old woman in London who knows her body, who knows her preferences, who knows what kind of man turns her on, who can talk about these things and communicate, and you ask her, do you regret that hookup? She'll be like, no, I worked really hard this week. I was literally looking forward to it, and it was wonderful. If you ask that same woman, do you regret any of the hookups you had when you were a fresher? She'll be like, oh my God, I didn't know myself. I didn't know how to ask what I wanted. The boys were terrible at it because they didn't know themselves. I don't think universities are a great place to get this information because that is when you are literally just exploring and going, is this anything? And we're all too embarrassed to say what we want or to say how that we like, oh. So you've got to put into that mix. Boys are told, you got to get laid. You got to get laid. Otherwise, you're not cool. Young women are told, you don't want too high a body count. You're going to get slut shamed. So you're talking about 18-year-olds who don't know themselves yet, and you're saying when the men are the scarcer resource, it's one way, women another way. That is exactly what I would expect to see.
那这边其实我有点听不懂 Deborah 想要 argue 的点到底是什么。他说 Erica and Louis 的研究数据是说25岁以下年轻的女性数据。他认为那些女性并不能代表32岁以上的年长女性，所以你看，光从这一点来看，难道现在女性主义还要分说你是32岁的还是你是25岁的女性主义这样吗？那 Erica and Louis 的论点之所以听起来更有逻辑，是因为32岁的女性也要先经历过25岁，经历过青少年时期吧。这边 Erica 的主张就是说现代的约炮文化和速食恋爱的这种风气对于年轻女性来说 is toxic， 是有害心理健康的。因此他们引用了大学男女人数和性文化开放的对比来去佐证他们的说辞，我认为这个是有逻辑的。而 Deborah 则是强调你们不能算那些年轻女性 I'm talking about 32 years old woman. The thing is 你不会20岁之后就突然变成32岁了吧。而这我觉得也呼应了现代女性的一个最大通病，也就是将自身或是少部分人的利益去投射强加在其他人身上，并把他们拿来当挡箭牌，也就是像是前面 Erica 所说的，利用你自身的自由去剥夺他人的自由。而往往这些人都是根本不了解到底何谓女性主义的那些人，这并不是说女权运动本身的问题。那你知道这像是什么？这像是前阵子在台湾身为年轻世代的一员，我也莫名其妙就被别人代表了反对重启核电的立场一样，就莫名其妙嘛，我只能这样说。
You're talking about 18-year-olds that don't know themselves yet.
What we are currently experiencing in our sexual culture where, yes, there's some structure, yes, there are some rules, but we are much, much more sexually, not just liberal, but even libertine than say, the sexual culture of our grandparents or whatever. I think everyone ought to be able to agree on that. There clearly is a change now in the sexual culture from previous generations, and it's mostly to do with the pill, as I argue. But the expectation is kind of, as you say, that you just have to figure it out. Like, there isn't a very clear template. Yes, maybe there isn't. I think that Deborah, you're actually right that most people do in the end aspire to monogamy and having children and everything. But there's also an expectation that you're supposed to experiment a bit in the meantime, and it's kind of actually weird to be a virgin on your wedding night. And I think that, yes, I mean, girls have to tread this really difficult tightrope where on the one hand they are at risk of slut shaming, but they're also at risk of being called frigid. They are much, much more at risk, actually, of being called frigid than in previous generations. And the idea that we can escape from social judgment around our sexual choices is probably not realistic. I think that basically that's what humans are like. We do just tend to be judgmental about this. But anyway, I don't think it's very wise to subject girls to this experience, is how I would put it. To say that you have to go through the hookup culture.
I know people who are opting out. I know young people who are absolutely opting out. They're not no freedom at all.
I'm going to agree with her and say freedom has become a pressure. There's become a societal pressure to be free. So
I know many young people who are opting out of the apps.
Okay, I'm a therapist, and I see so many young people, and I give lectures, and people come up to me. So I can say, and I write books about adolescence, and I'm going to say that mostly the term hookup culture is used between 15 and 30. So you're correct in saying a 32-year-old woman should have the right to have sex with whoever the hell she wants to have sex with. And I'm right there with you. She should have choice, whatever. But young women, young men who are developing emotionally, mentally,
should not have the right.
No,
they shouldn't have the right.
Let me, can I finish?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, sorry. So you interrupted, so I didn't get to finish.
I'm so sorry.
Okay. So they're more vulnerable. They are more vulnerable emotionally to what the hookup culture does to them. There's a lot of research to say that it causes loneliness, depression, anxiety, tons of regret, embarrassment, shame, self-esteem issues. And so, of course, we want freedom. In fact, I'm probably more in agreement with you on most things than you think. But in this, I say that freedom can become its own prison. So if you think about the early feminists, the really early feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, those women were fighting patriarchy. They were fighting a system that said they had to be a certain way. So of course I don't accept what Iran does to women. I mean, that, but what's happened is if the pendulum swings too far, you have a different kind of patriarchy on the other side. We say the extreme left and the extreme right actually meet in the middle. And so have we just we never want to take choice away. The idea of taking choice away from women to have sex with whoever they want to have sex with, that's not the point of this. It's, have we created a society which pressures young women in its own way to be promiscuous, to have lots of experiences? It's not all glorious, freedom. It is glorious, but it's also not all glorious. And it can be a pressure on young people to get rid of their virginity, to have lots of sexual experiences. And it's not all it's cracked up to be for them. It really isn't. In terms of their mental health, again, they are more, we say, 9 to 25, really 27 in young men, is the second critical period of brain development, where they are very susceptible to their relational experiences and their environment. And so in that period of development, which is mostly what we use the term hookup culture for, it's in that very young developmental period. It's not just in college, it's throughout their 20s, until that woman becomes 32. That's a very vulnerable brain. And so we have created a culture that confuses that brain, that offers too many choices, that pressures them into having multiple partners and many experiences, and leaves them feeling empty and lonely.
那艾瑞卡这边讲到了一个重点，极端与极端之间的对立啊，往往是殊途同归。我觉得这一定程度上啊，就描写了现代父权 vs 女权的现况。要对抗父权啊，并不是把女权打造为一个新的父权，或成为一个新的控制势力， 所以 Debra 的论述中，你可以听到，他认为男性都可以享有 XYZ 的权利。例如说，他认为男生可以到处打炮，而且还不会被污名化，其实他们想干嘛就可以干嘛，不会被社会的框架给绑住，很自由等等。因此，女性也应该享有这样的权利。It's like no。Sure， 在现代的社会里女性当然也可以是事业很有成，被大家都称赞为很独立的女性的一个 role model。而如果她选择呢，到处去酒吧，到处去夜店，与他人发生一夜情，也完全没有问题，因为这是属于她的自由和她的自主性。但她如果因此呢被贴上各种标签 slut or whatever， that's also normal。你不能一昧的去提倡自由、选择权等好听的话，却忘记选择的背后也有你本该承担的责任。or 你也可以选择不要到处去 fuck around， 而是遇到真正有感情的人再发生关系。就像 Debra 自己所说的 ，Yes, it's a choice。你也可以是一位事业有成的独立女性，且同时也有一位爱你、保护你的丈夫。And that doesn't make you weak。在父权主义中那女人只能依靠男人，因此女人就要听话的这种固化思维，自然应该被淘汰。但不代表我们要完全否定男人照顾女人的这种美德，觉得女性没有男人会活得更好男人都是群有毒的群体这种极端思维。而是更应该去发扬光大身为母亲、身为全职妈妈的重要性和伟大。事实上，在我认知中的女权是因为女性因为要育儿，因为要请产假，导致他们的工作机会或是薪水会因此被公司占便宜。那这才是我觉得真正该去改变以及正视的话题。政府或许该给付更多的育儿津贴，或是对于全职妈妈呢有更多的福利措施等。I don't know， 这是其中一种可能解决方式，但绝对不是像是比烂一样，把男人的陋习好像变成是女人也该享有的权利一样。
Can I just say though, again to the time traveler piece, I did not. You recommend, Louise, because I heard you talking on this podcast before, that people don't have sex till they're engaged. But if you're engaged, the next step is marriage. So presumably you're going to marry that person, i.e. you're going to sleep with, the first person you sleep with, if you take that advice, is your partner. So you're going to have one sexual partner for life. I do not recommend that, ideally, because I came from a religion where that was the only option. And because I didn't meet anybody, I atrophied. I had no intimacy. I felt so lonely. Now, you're saying sometimes people have a hookup and they feel lonely afterwards. Totally, of course. That's happened to everyone who's ever had casual sex in any quantity where you feel a bit like, oh, that didn't fill me up. It's like, when they say you go and have a Chinese meal and you feel hungry half an hour later and you were wanting more. There is no utopia here. There's only options. And what happened to me, because I had no option, I had no autonomy, I became more and more atrophied, more and more lonely, more and more empty, more and more disconnected from myself. To this day, I struggle with that. I struggle with intimacy, with because we were in such a culture of you can't have sex before you get married that you didn't really make eye contact with people. Normal teenagers will sit on each other's laps and just experiment a little bit, or they might have a little kiss or whatever. If you don't have anything like that, you can't really look at people properly because, it might lead to something. It took me so long to heal, guys. And however old you think I was when I lost my virginity, I was older. And it was tough because if you're losing your virginity very late, the person you're losing it with has had a more regular, healthy, in my opinion, sexual development. They've had their first girlfriend or boyfriend. They've experienced a few things. It's still hard for me to say what I want. So I don't recommend the other thing either, which is don't have sex with anyone until you're ready to prepared at least to marry them.
First of all, 我也不认为说女性必须要守贞直到婚姻，或是一定要和第一位发生关系的人结婚这种过时的观念。但我有点不确定 Louis 什么时候说过这样的话了，也有可能是我漏掉。但从 Debra 的论述听起来，我觉得稍微有那么点点在情勒的味道。不断的去强调自己因为这种封建的文化受到了多少创伤等等，但老实说，我也记不得 Louis and Erica 有说过要恢复这种封建的制度那感觉这就是一种稻草人谬论将对方的论点扭曲后，再借由反对那个扭曲的论点来显得自己好像说的有道理一样。Debra 说她同意约炮文化和随便性爱的这种风险会使人在事后感到孤独和感到不满足。And then 她的论述是 There's no utopia, there's only option。这里没有乌托邦只有不同的选择 ，which is kind of true honestly。所以 Erica 前面不就是在提出呢，她反对这种选择， 因为他认为说约炮文化即便可以让女性享受肉体上的欢愉，但在长期心理上的负面影响看起来是不可逆的。但是 Deborah 就好像是跳针一样，如果你不同意让女生享受性爱，你就是在否定女性的权利，你就是要回到以前那封建的制度。It's like no。那换言之Deborah 该强调的是女性有没有选择的这个权利，而不是不断利用女性的权利这个免死金牌当作满足她欲望正大光明的一个借口。那当然，每个人对于是否拥有该权利的定义并不同。就我来说，如果女性选择到处去约炮，然后被贴上一个标签，我不认为是代表女性没有这项权利的一个合理论述。但如果你说一位女性她想当全职妈妈，但政府给予的津贴却很少，导致她必须要出去工作养孩子，或者是必须要将孩子交给育儿中心，那又或者是说一位女性她想到职场工作，但公司给的机会却很少，或是配很低，这种会实质影响到她选择权利的时候，我认为才是可以去 argue 权利所属的一个合理论述。
I've got a graph here that somewhat dovetails into this conversation about when you should have sex and also marriage as a subject. And it shows that from the 1970s, roughly women would get married at about 21 years old. And now, this graph will be on the screen, it's about 30. Men used to get married at around 23 years old, and now it's just over 30, which is a pretty crazy climb. So it feels to me if the sexual revolution took place in around this era where we see this rapid climb, maybe the two are somewhat interlinked, i.e. the age in which we'd be getting married or having sex under Louise's, potential advice that it's better to wait.
It's because of the pill. That's why that happened. Mm-hmm. It's because it used to be that if you were having sex with someone, you were risking pregnancy. And now that's not, it is still true because actually all contraception fails and something like half of women in this country get pregnant didn't mean to or whatever. So the idea that it's foolproof is not true. But what the pill did when it arrived on the scene in the late 60s was it gave the illusion that sex was consequence-free. And it isn't on a physical level, not really. It's less consequential than it was because of the pill. But the physical consequences are still there. But I think just as importantly, it became no less emotionally consequential. Just because you're on the pill or using condoms or whatever, your mind, I'm thinking particularly of women who, as we talked about, bond more quickly, your mind still thinks that this person could well become the father of my child. You are still experiencing sex as in the way that all of our ancestors did for all of human history up until 5 minutes ago, until we invented this new technology. And I think that's why it has to, the reason that women have evolved to be picky about who they have sex with is because getting pregnant is an extraordinarily consequential thing for women. It's dangerous, it's difficult, it's a huge, investment of their time and of their life. And you don't want to get pregnant by some bozo. Right? That's why women tend to be very selective about who they're willing to have sex with and feel really bad. And I've got to say, I'm leaving aside words like sacred, because they're obviously difficult because of the religious implications. I think that we should, as feminists, describe sex as at least special, like having some kind of special status. It's not like other kinds of socializing. It's not like having a conversation with someone or playing tennis with someone. And we can tell that it's
been doing it wrong.
But we can tell.
Well, we could call it one of the most intimate experiences you can have as a human being.
And that's why rape is so bad, right? That's why feminists are
so... Because it bastardizes the most intimate experience by making it by turning it into violence.
Rape is worse than theft, for instance. Or rape is worse than assault, like non-sexual assault. And the law recognises that. And we all socially recognise that because there is something uniquely intimate and therefore uniquely violating about having sex without consent. And I think that it's really hard actually to hold those two things simultaneously in mind and say sex is unimportant. It's basically just like a skill set that you can practice on other people, that it's a leisure activity, all this kind of...
It trivialises
Right. And then also say, but consent is extraordinarily important. Like, why? Do you not see the contradiction there?
Autonomy.
好，停在这边确实有点魔鬼剪辑了，我承认。但这边我帮大家解释一下 Louis 最后说的这个观点，因为我一开始其实也搞混了。Louis 最后是问 Deborah 说你一直强调做爱可以是一件很稀松平常的事，但你同时又强调 consent 就是取得同意也是一件非常重要的事，你不觉得这两个逻辑互相矛盾吗？ 那这边 Louis 说的并不是说反正都有人在约炮了，那如果我突然想要上一个人，就算没有得到他的同意也还好吧，他不是这个意思。他是在说从我们的法律制度上来看，强制性交罪是比一般的伤害罪和恐吓罪来得更严重的。也就是说，社会也认为在性方面的自主更是应该被保护，更是应该被重视的。但你今天跳出来说做爱其实是一件很稀松平常的事嘛，就像你去约人家喝咖啡一样，难道你认为女人给我过来跟我去喝一杯星巴克，跟女人给我过来跟我去开房间是能放在一个天平上对等看待的吗？如果不行的话，是不是代表性爱并不像是你所说的只是很单纯的一种社交，或是很单纯的一种只要我想就可以，反正没有任何后果的一个行为呢？Louis 的论述是这样的。
If I want it, if I want somebody, especially penetrative sex, you're talking about rape, you're talking about penetrative sex, there's nothing worse than somebody inside your body violating your actual insides. Nothing worse than that. That does not mean that women do not have sexual urges that are exciting. Yeah, I know. I'm finished sentence. I wasn't allowed to drop. That women don't have sexual urges that are just about attraction and a moment and fun and play. Play is so important to human beings. When I left that cult, it took me a long time and a number of different sexual experiences to find out what kind of sexuality I even had. You can't necessarily find it with the first person you meet. They may not be sexually compatible with you. And you may not know how to communicate well with them and end up having a life of very boring missionary position sex. If you encourage young people just to have sex with the first person they meet and stay with that person, which I'm not saying you're saying, but I am saying if you don't have sex before you're engaged, well, engagement leads to marriage, you may end up with very little sexual fulfillment compared to what you could have had. You might not. You might get lucky. The first person you meet might just be amazing in bed with you and you find your space together and it might be wonderful. But I would say that is unlikely. And I would say that the reason that the pill changed how much sex women had and with what variety of partners is because it gave them autonomy. It gave them agency. Suddenly, I can. And guess what? When I can, I choose to try. When you give women the choice, which the pill did, to have some experience, we see that most women want some experience, want to find themselves sexually, want to feel, oh, this or not that, or yeah, or oh my God, this one. This is amazing. I could be with this guy forever. We hit it off. He's great in bed. We're working together. Oh, we've got a little problem now, but we'll work through it together because we love each other. Most people do some version of that. And maybe they hit a point in that monogamy where this relationship isn't working anymore, or something terrible happens, and they have another go at that. That's a large pattern. Now, how much of that is because that's what society expects? I don't know. But that is what most people tend to do. So for me, saying that because one night at a music festival, I had a really passionate, exciting encounter with somebody who I never saw again, that I am somehow minimizing rape is very disturbing.
那就 Debra 最后的观点来看，我是认同的。我觉得就算把做爱当作是一件很稀松平常的事也不代表说这就淡化了强制性交的罪行。但这是他整段的论述我觉得只有这一点是比较合理的。前面讲的，我觉得根本都跟 Louis 还有 Erica 的强调不在同一个点上。我不知道是我的理解错误还是怎么样。Debra 不断强调 autonomy and agency 自主权还有选择权，那我有点不太理解到底是在指哪一个部分。如果是说女生能不能像男生一样去合理的约炮、合理的一夜情，我认为是可以的。因为事后不管是男是女都会被称作是玩咖嘛。但如果你认为在父权思想下，男性玩咖会被认为是有实力，而女性玩咖会被认为是很随便、很 easy， 而觉得女性因此人受到不公的话，那老实说呢，我觉得 it is what it is。这个社会就是这样运作的。就像在父权体制下，男生也很常抱怨说被社会被身边的人认为说要照顾大家，要坚强，不能说累，不能难过。那我们也想要改变也想要正大光明的示弱，但不会有人因此就跑去游行示威说如果你嘲笑男人酷你擅自叫男人说要坚强的话，你就是在歧视男人的这种言论吧。社会要运作本该就还是有它的框架在的。所以这好像也呼应了前面说到了现代女权主义的问题之一，就是他们缺乏了一个核心的诉求。 不断的去说女性要自由，要更多的选择，但到底是什么样的自由和为了什么的自由呢 ？Is what we're talking about。那当然，我们并不是要讲其他的话题，而是仅限于今天谈论关于性的这个问题。所以说，我觉得目前的辩论有点像是鸡同鸭讲的感觉，因为对我来说女生的确有选择去一夜情和滑交友软体等权利的自由，那就让我好奇她的论点到底是什么。如果有我没有看懂的地方，也欢迎观众帮我补充一下。
Can I just interject and just say that you're right in turning to me and saying I didn't mean that you have to marry your first partner, but there's something very important about the emotional connection. And that's coming from maybe me being a therapist and knowing and seeing the pain that the young people who come to me are in when there's no emotional connection and they give their bodies over. By the way, young men too. I think it's shifting, actually. It's interesting what I'm seeing in my practice. Young men are more vulnerable than women now. Women have taken on the role that young men used to have emotionally. And so, women have all these choices, and now they're leaving young men in the dust, and the young men are feeling lonely, and they have sex with a girl and they want to date her, and she says, no, I'm sleeping with 5 guys at the same time. And these are kids in their 20s. But sex is better with emotional connection. It doesn't mean you have to marry the first guy that you have sex with. I also want to say that there is something called neurotic repetition. A lot of the early feminists had a lot of trauma. You had trauma. A lot of people have had trauma. And what happens with trauma is it tends to be like PTSD. If we have disconnection early on, or abuse, or violence against us, attachment disorders, as I've talked about in your other podcasts when you're very young, it gets reenacted and repeated throughout your life over and over and over and over again. So interestingly, the early feminists were mostly traumatized women. If you look at the histories of them, they had physically abusive fathers, alcoholic fathers. They had uncles who raped them. They had, terrible, even their mothers too. Just really abusive parents, but mostly the men in their life were horrible. And so a lot of this whole experience depends on where you come from and what you had. If you've had good models, it's why I sort of talk about, I'm writing a book about divorce. Why am I writing a book about divorce if I believe in relationships? Because divorce is going to happen and we need to help parents to know how to raise healthy children in spite of it. But relationships matter. They matter in the raising of children. So when we have a disconnected society where we say relationships don't matter, just sex matters. Sex. Of course sex matters. But what I say to young people is sex is a very small part of a relationship. It really is, because in the beginning it's hot. And then as you get to know each other and you have the daily comings and goings of life, it's the friendship, it's the connection, it's the companionship, it's the relationship. But if you've had a lot of trauma, then you are not going to turn towards relationships, and you are not going to turn towards men. If men traumatized you and you saw a man abuse your mother, of course you're not going to want men in your life. So a lot of it, I think the feminist movement does something which it's first of all, I'm going to say it's done a lot of good. I wouldn't be here. None of us would be here without it. Those women that took the risks, we have to be grateful toward. But what it also did is it distorted a lot of the importance of relationships and how important male and female relationships are. I'll stop there because I've talked too much. But
那自这个主题的交手来看，Erica 的论述维度还有框架都比 Deborah 还来得更加深远。Erica 强调了是对于教育的影响，对于孩子们成长的影响，对于当代年轻人的心理影响等具体有根据还有研究资料的这个佐证。他的论证也保持了一致，认为说女权运动潮仍然为现代的女性开拓了许多以前不曾拥有的选择权和自由，但在这方面也有可能已经走偏，甚至是被污染成想要去替代父权思想，想要成为另外一股控制社会思想的势力而已。
Can I say something about agency? Because this word came up earlier and I've been thinking a lot about it recently, and I just find it interesting as a subject. So I think that actually a better way of thinking about agency than is this binary thing that, humans have agency, etc., is is it's kind of more of a personality trait. I think that some people are very agentic. Some people are able to set their minds on doing something and they just make it happen. Those people are very well suited to making their own decisions. Those people hate the idea of any kind of limits on their freedom. But they are unusual people. Most people actually, they go with the flow. They kind of do what other people around them are doing. They drift a little bit. They're a little bit passive. They kind of make decisions based on what seems normal. They follow the template as it appears to them in their moment. You know, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that those people are more vulnerable to bad scripts. Mm-hmm. The problem with the sexual liberation narrative is it assumes that everyone is highly agentic. It assumes that everyone is capable of being faced with all these various choices and saying, I'm going to choose this one and that one and making it happen, rather than what I think is more realistic, and particularly when you're talking about young people, and I think even more talking about young women. I think young women are particularly mimetic, and particularly, I mean, there are studies showing this, that women are, for instance, more likely to imitate other people's body language. They're more likely to, they pick up slang more quickly than men do. Like, young women are very socially attuned, like more than any other group. They're very alive to what's high status and low status and like keen to imitate it. You also see this with fashion, all sorts of things, right? I think to just say to those young women, good news, you can choose anything you want. You can do anything you want. Obviously, if you are highly agentic, I think you mentioned, Deborah, young people who are just like, no, I'm not into this, off the apps, not doing it. They're highly agentic. That's very impressive, but it's rare. Like, most people actually are basically going to do what their peers do. And so that's why I think just saying, give everyone choice and kind of close the lid and say, good luck. I think that doesn't work. I think that actually we need to be a bit more prescriptive.
那这边 Louis 点出了一个很有趣的论点，认为说社会上大部分的人都还是在追随和模仿风气还有趋势而已。就像不可能每个人都是当老板当创业家的料，大部分的人呢一定还是跟着公司的主管跟着社会的体制走。那么如果站在公共利益的角度上呢，在制定规则这方面，我们想必是为了大部分人，也就是多数人的角度去靠拢的。因此如果为了特定的族群的利益来去达到一个假的平衡，实质呢是要去牺牲掉剩余人的权利，那这样根本就是本末倒置。你也可以理解成近期 DEI 所产生的各种乱象和问题一样。所以我认为现在的人的确拥有要不要到处约炮，要不要用交友软体的这个选择权了。没有认为说因为一两个人或是某部分人群认为交友软体不好，所以就把它 ban 掉，没有。但是也因为大家不断的去鼓吹以及合理化约炮文化的这个趋势，也导致于说人们不得不去使用交友软体，因为大家都在用，大家都这么做，这也是一个不争的事实。当然这背后并不是完全是女权的锅，还有各种复杂的因素存在。那我们能做的是不是透过教育也好，宣导的文宣也好，透过一些方式呢来去倡导长期伴侣的重要性，还有随便的性交或速食恋爱这种在心理上的潜在风险等等，来去想办法解决已经发生的问题，而不是反而要加大力度，好像去猎巫一样的心态去指责那些批评的声音，认为说他们就是想违反女性的性自主权，扣上他们这样就是在破坏女性的这种帽子。
Women were less agentic before the sexual revolution. Overall, as a population, we are more agentic now. We have more agency, and we flex that agency more frequently. If you are worried that young women seem to you to be mimetic, i.e. influenced by their peer group, then we need education for what's happening in that peer group. I don't disagree with you that thinking about intimacy, thinking about, do I really want to do this with my body? Do I want to let this boy touch me here or there, or this girl, do this or that with me or whatever? Of course. But that's education so they can have agency. And that's the discussions that the parents have, ideally the schools are having. We desperately need that.
That's what we're doing here, right? We're trying to.
Yeah.
But rather than saying they need rules, I would say they need to be further attuned to their own desires, their own body, their own environments, relationships. How long does it feel right to me? Listening to my own body, listening to my own mind, having confidants that they can talk to who are older and more responsible if they don't feel comfortable talking to their parents, because some kids, of course, teenagers don't necessarily go, Mom, I had this urge. Do you provide other people in their community who they might have that conversation with? There are all sorts of ways that we can make sure our girls and our boys have agency and listen to themselves. But when I hear rules, when I hear it's just better for them not to until they're engaged and then just stick with that person for life, ideally, I fear that is taking us back generations, and women 100% were not happier then. They put up with more.
I do want to separate young people from what you were talking about, adult women. I want to separate them because they're not the same species. There's so much development going on in adolescence. And adolescence, as I said, goes on till 25. So by the time you're an adult woman, you are, for the most part, developed. By the time you get to 32, there's going to be stuff going on, but the major part of your personality and character development is pretty much set. And so that developing period is really more my concern. It's not that I'm not concerned about my older patients who come to me and talk about how free sex and, multiple partners makes them feel good. I would say, great, it's your choice. If that makes you feel good, wonderful. But in young people where they're developing, I agree with you that we need more education. I'm all for more education, but I'm for so we have so much sex education right now in schools, too much sex education, if you ask me. We're teaching 9-year-olds about anal sex. We're teaching them about genital warts. That's not something a 9-year-old needs to know, in school. So, but I think we're not teaching them about emotional connection, about relationships, about family, about the arc of a life. That if you want to be single and you want to have multiple partners and you want to be free, that's your choice. I have no problem with that. But we're not teaching about the importance of connection and emotional connection and building families. And so what do we have? We have a bunch of young people out there who are having sex but feeling empty and lonely and depressed and anxious and not knowing why. Because we are teaching sex, but we're not teaching about connection.
Can I also say, and I don't know that it's true that in the UK that we're teaching 9-year-olds about anal, by the way, but the thing that's lacking in sex education often here is pleasure. They do not talk about how pleasurable it can be, or that girls should be, when they have their first sexual experience, ideally as young women, that are not girls, but of course they should be young women, they should be of age, that their pleasure matters. There's so many young women who at the first just go, I guess I have to do this, and he has to find pleasure in it. But learning what makes your own body feel pleasure is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Knowing that it can give you great intimacy and it can be a lifelong relationship partner and all
so that's
those
a
things.
1950s idea. The 1950s were a time, nobody wants to go back to the 1950s. When the books that I write, people come up to me and they say, you want women to go back to being pregnant and barefoot in the kitchen. I'm like, what? No, we don't want to go back to the 50s because women didn't have choice and women didn't know about orgasm and they didn't know about, that sex could be pleasurable. And so we don't want to go back. We want to move forward. We want to take the best of, the highlights of the past and not leave all of the good parts of the past behind and, take the good parts of the feminist movement too. But there's a lot of it that's not so good. And I'm going to agree with Louise that there are so many young women and older women, but let's just say young women.
Don't point at me and say older women.
No, I'm old too. Older, over 32.
I'll admit to over 32, Erica, and that's all I can give you.
But that's all we're doing. That's all we're doing. You're older than 25. There are so many young women who are looking to understand the secret sauce. What is going to make them the happiest? I don't love the word happy, but I think our young people are so very unhappy. They have never been so unhappy. The statistics on mental illness and unhappiness and loneliness we have all this sexual freedom. We have all of these feminist ideals, and yet young women are so very unhappy.
好，那这边有点长我帮大家快速整理一下。基本上 Erica 这边就是在说，他也认可 Debra 所说的，我们必须透过教育去教导年轻人如何和人建立一段良好的关系，包括性关系，去了解自身拥有的权利和自主权。这也是 Erica 和 Debra 双方都同意的。 那我并不是教育或育儿专业啊，我也无从去判断这种人与人的交流关系等议题到底能不能透过教育的方式来传达。不过我相信价值观还有感情观这种东西，一定是根据我们成长周遭的环境在不知不觉中养成的嘛。那如果是这样来看的话，教育体系啊，似乎的确是一个可行的方案。那我必须说，这场 debate 的问题啊，或是说我挣扎的点，就是我看到现在，我越来越搞不懂 Deborah 的论点核心到底是什么？是25岁以上，还是说32岁以上的成年女性没有性自主权吗？那怎么个没有性自主权法，或者是他很爱说的自由呢？因为从 Erica 的论述来看啊，他不同意 Deborah 所说的约炮文化，而他的原因是因为这些性开放的文化带来了许多心理上的副作用，而他的观点也有科学的证据来去佐证。但反观 Deborah 目前提到的大部分女性不知道性爱可以是很愉悦的，言下之意难道是在说，如果每个女性都知道性爱能带来多大的刺激，她相信全世界的女生都会像是打开开关一样来去疯狂约炮，于是她现在在做的事情呢，是提前为那些还未解放的女性铺路吗？还是怎么样？这个论述的基础还有证据又是从何而来？那就算我们撇开这点不谈，他也已经多次把 Louis and Erica 的观点曲解成你们就是想回到50年代你们就是想回到女性受压迫的那个传统年代这样的一个行为。所以 Erica 最后也才很无奈的表示，没有人想回到过去，但不可否认过去固然还是有过去的好，而我们该做呢，是从历史中吸收精华，并将缺点改进，而不是一昧的去否定掉过去的一切。
I think we've got a causation correlation problem there. I think the world is not well. We are really looking down the barrel of climate change, land wars. Cost of living is out of control. Young people will never own a home unless their parents give them an enormous amount of money. There are so many factors feeding into the unhappiness of people of all ages, and young people look at this long future and go, what is this going to be for me? I think to blame feminism for that is misguided.
It's a piece of the puzzle. And remember that my lens is a lens of seeing patients who come to me for relational issues.
So therefore, you've got a biased set of information. The people that are unhappy with their relationships come to you. Yes, everything's a piece of the puzzle. But if it wasn't this, it would be that. And what that was, I'm stuck with this person now that we're not having sex and it's a miserable time and he doesn't talk to me and I don't talk to him, but I can't really get out of it. Human beings find ways to be dissatisfied with their lot in life. Somebody who we look at and go, my God, they're so fortunate. They've got everything they want is probably one of the unhappiest people because they're going, is this all there is? That's why often you'll see like a rock star or a movie star get absolutely everything they want and they have to go up a mountain to talk to a guru because they're like, well, I was hoping that I'd be super successful and wealthy and, have all this choice. And now I've got that and I'm still not happy. And the idea that we can look at unhappiness with what is here and then say, if this wasn't here, but that was here, those same people would be blissfully happy doesn't bear out with history.
那这段也是在我整部看下来最傻眼也觉得不解的地方。那 Deborah 声称Erica 的观点是带有偏见的，是因为她的视角总是围绕在那些因为感情出问题而生病去找她的人。但我们是不是也同时可以说 Deborah 的所有发言以及理念都是建立在她那从小被加入邪教所产生的创伤之上呢？这同样是不是代表了她的观点是偏颇甚至是极端的？那前面说的，我也认可现代人的心病并不只是女性主义引起的。其他包括像是说战争或是经济上的困难也都是一大一个因素，而这 Erica 也承认确实只是其中的一片拼图而已。但 Deborah 不断强调的，许多已经结婚的成年女性在没有了性生活之后却也无法离婚，卡在一段婚姻的这一段论述的佐证又是什么？如果是她亲身的体验或是她看到的事物，是不是代表也是她自己的有色眼镜呢？那至少从 Erica 提出的观点来说都是有数字以及研究来去证明的。退一步来说即便 Deborah 陈述的问题确实存在，那他提出来的方法及所有人都该享有性爱自主权，只要我有性需求就该被满足其他俗世的责任和后果都不关我的事的这个论述，难道就是正确的吗？如果不同意也不管人家的论点，就开始贴标签你们是在忽视女性的声音，你们是父权的帮凶，你们想回到过去。尤其他自己说的这句人总是会找到理由对自己的生活感到不满，我觉得听起来真的是满满的讽刺事实上在我们现有的法律基础上来看，在婚姻上也都大多是在保护女性的权利居多。那如果连这种正规的法律途径都不谈论，而是一股脑的去要求说社会不该批评我想要离婚就离，因为我产生了这个欲望，而这个欲望就该被满足，这并不叫自由。 这才叫乌托邦啊！想要享有无尽的自由啊，却不愿去承担自己的行为所带来的后果以及责任。
So I actually think what does bear out is that human beings universally, from birth, crave security. We know that. They crave safety and security and stability from birth. And we don't teach that. We say just be impulsive, be in the moment. And I think that's a lot of what's causing the unhappiness, is that we don't help educate and strategize what a good life means to you. Now, maybe for you, a good life is just being free and, you know, having a great career. And I have no problem with that. I'm the first one to say the women's movement gave women choice to have the life they want to have. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of women who feel bullied by this narrative of freedom. They feel bullied by it. And I hear it in my practice. I see it online on my, my Instagram following and people writing. And you're right. I have a particular lens, so people may come to me because of that. But what I will say is that the feminist movement, at least the second wave of the feminist movement, was a little bit of a cabal in a sense that it was a small group of women saying every woman should feel this way. Every woman should want to go out to work and leave their children in daycare. Every woman should want free sex. And the bottom line is a lot of women don't. A lot of women want the choice to be respected, to have intimate and loving and marital relationships and monogamy. And they want to be able to stay home with their children and have society say, you are amazing, and admire them for it. And what I know is that there's a lot of young women and adult women who are feeling pressured to live a life that isn't making them happy, that is without relationships, that's without having one intimate partner, that is, freedom without any limits.
If women feel bullied by freedom, I feel like they should try the alternative. I still feel the predominant narrative is the rom-com one. The predominant narrative is you should be married by 30, with a white dress. Everyone should stand around and say, you've done it now. You should have babies. That to me is still the predominant narrative, that you are successful if you have achieved these things. Now, it is true that many women feel also they should have some kind of career. That is very true. But I feel like the main thing that women are asked to aspire to, if you really look around, it is still find the one, have the rom-com ending. And I do not see this idea that women are told the whole time we should be out on the town, sleeping with everyone in town. Far from it. And I know this isn't true because I went to a school that's a very, very good girls' school. It's a state school, but a very, very high-end one in London in 2018 when we were all out marching in the street, the Women's March. Recently, I went back and all those girls are talking about being a high-value woman, which is from the manosphere and not too high, having not too high a body count. These are obviously different girls. The ones 2018 went off to university. That's in 7 years. They were saying, in 2018, 2019, around that time, they were saying no slut shaming, listen to your body. They weren't saying run around and have sex with everybody or I've got to have a lot of lovers. They were saying, I make my own decisions. I don't, listen to patriarchal ideas about how I need to live my life. I am going to go to university. I'm going to meet people and make meaningful relationships, and some of those will be friendships. They are now talking manosphere talk.
那么第一阶段的辩论就到这边就结束了。后面大概还有1个半小时的内容，如果你有兴趣的话，再留言告诉我想看后续好了。而最后这一段，我想留给大家自由讨论好了。你对 Erica 所主张的Deborah 口中的这种自由，其实压得许多女性喘不过气，又怎么看呢？这会不会是一种翻版的父权主义的一种形式呢？像是传统中的父权主义认为男性要 being a provider， 要照顾好大家，被这样一个社会期许所压垮。那从另外一方面来看你对于 Deborah 整场的论点又有什么想法呢？你觉得主流上大家仍然还是认为女性就应该30岁前出嫁，并认为这才是一个成功的人生版图吗？而这种观念是该被推翻还是保留的呢？另外在性的这方面，你认为当代女性并没有被灌输她们可以较为容易与他人发生性关系的这个观念吗？你认为在性方面我们要比现在更加的开放，还是比现在更加的保守？那对于现状又存在什么样的一个问题呢？ 在底下留言告诉我你的想法吧。那最后再让我补充一句啊，不管是男性主义还是女性主义，哪种解决方法更好或者是更差，我觉得大家应该都去认知到极端的父权和极端的女权都一定是有毒的。如果说鼓励女性去成为妈妈，并提供实质上的经济补助，会不会才是最正解呢？但这样会不会因此给那些不想生育甚至是结婚的女性贴上一个不好的标签呢？我们到底该怎么做去找到一个中间的平衡，确实是值得大家去深思的一个问题。那么数字6，我们下一部影片见。